We are now entering a period called the Late Classical Period, which is basically the late 5th century BCE, 431, 404. This is marked by the devastating Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. So there's decades of war between the Greek city-states, with various city-states taking sort of the sides of Athens or Sparta. Eventually Sparta wins and controls Greece, and then later this is taken over by Thebes. But really what happens is Greece kind of falls apart, and the sort of the glorious age of the classical period sort of falls away. And then from north of Greece, in a place called Macedonia, a ruler named Philip II invades Greece, and he defeats the United City-States in 338. Philip is assassinated, and then his son, a man named Alexander, who becomes Alexander the Great, takes over. Now, Alexander, like his father, was a fan of Greek culture. Alexander was taught by Greek tutors. He learned Greek philosophy. He spoke Greek. This is a civilization that was greatly admired by the Macedonians and by Alexander and his father. So Alexander, in many ways, doesn't want to destroy Greece. He wants to rule it, but he wants to bring it back sort of to its glorious age. But Alexander is key because he spreads Greek culture wherever he goes. And so we'll talk more about what happens after he dies. But in his campaign, he conquers a huge portion of the Mediterranean and the Middle Eastern world. In fact, his armies march all the way to the Indus River. And we will see the influence of Greek culture everywhere he went, from Alexandria in Egypt to Pergamon in what is modern-day Turkey. He spreads Greek culture everywhere, and we'll see how that happens after his death, actually. So he dies in 323 BCE, probably of typhoid fever. We're not exactly sure, but he got sick, and he died actually in Assyria. He died in one of the old Assyrian palaces on one of his conquests. Ironically, he was sort of turning around to go back and bring his troops home when he got sick and died. So this eventual collapse of the Greek city-states and the Peloponnesian Wars, and then subsequently the conquering by Alexander the Great, changes the nature of Greek culture, and it changes the nature of Greek art. And so this is the atmosphere of what we call the late classical period. Now, we still see elements of the high classical period all over the place. I mean, look at this image here. We have contrapposto, we have realism, we have naturalism, we have display of emotion. So all of the things that you're used to seeing, we have here. But we have something also completely new. This is by one of three high classical or late classical artists we'll be studying. Sculptors will be studying. This guy is named Praxiteles. And Praxiteles brought a sensuality and even a kind of a sexiness to Greek art that wasn't there before, especially in large-scale public sculpture. And this is what this is. Now, this is the Aphrodite of Cnidus. This is actually not the original. This is a Roman marble copy of the original. And on the left is another copy that is actually probably a better copy, but we only have the head. And so you were looking at something that was very controversial, though, because this is a nude female statue, a nude statue of a goddess, of the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. And this was controversial. When the artist Praxiteles was first commissioned, the story goes that he made two copies of this sculpture, one clothed and one unclothed. And the original people he made it for rejected the nude version and decided to go with the clothed version. And then he sold the unclothed version to Cneidos. But this is a rather sensual sculpture. Yes, it is an image of a goddess. Yes, it is Venus. She is covering herself up. There is a sense of modesty here. But this being the first sort of all-nude statue of a woman in a Greek society, there is a certain scandalousness about it. At the same time, people were intrigued. It brought a lot of visitors and tourists to the temple where it was placed, but it also created a feeling of desire. There's stories of people groping this statue, of grabbing it, there's several descriptions of how beautiful it is, and written in a rather indelicate, let's say, sort of way. People talking about the shape of her body and her buttocks, and it gets a little racy. So we're seeing something that the classical Greeks would have never done, which was to sort of inject an earthiness and a lustiness into their sculpture, a sensuality that wasn't there before. Because remember, classical sculpture is about perfection. It is about moral perfection. It is about physical perfection. It is about controlling one's baser urges, because the Greeks believed we had an obligation to the gods, right? This is what they believe. We have an obligation to the gods to improve ourselves, to better ourselves. That's why Greeks were obsessed with this idea of perfection, because remember, goodness and beauty were synonymous. They were the same thing in ancient Greek art. And so that's why you have all these sort of nude, awesomely built, buff male statues standing around looking thoughtful, because that was the Greek ideal. But here we have this sort of sensualized nudity. This isn't nudity to show off the power or the strength or the morality of the male nude body, but this is a sensual nude body. Here we have another example. This is another religious statue. This is a statue of Hermes and his little brother, Dionysus. Hermes was taking Dionysus to protect him because Hera wanted to kill him, because he was the product of a liaison between Zeus and another woman. And so, as always, Zeus did what he wasn't supposed to do. Hera gets jealous of the offspring and tries to kill him. So Hermes is taking his brother to safety. This is created by a follower of Praxiteles. Son, maybe grandson, we don't know. But this is once again another copy of a Praxiteles original. And once again, you can always tell the Roman copies. If you don't remember, Romans love marble statues. The Greeks, for their freestanding sculptures, preferred bronze. Romans liked marble, though. Marble isn't as strong as bronze. It tends to break. And so what we're looking at very often is you have these weird things like tree stumps and these odd little blocks in these marble statues that would not have been present in the original bronzes. So sort of erase that from your mind. But look at the sensuality of this sculpture, and I don't mean necessarily sexuality, although you could read this as sexy too, I guess. But the contrapposto has, the contrapposto, remember, is this sort of counterbalance that was invented in classical Greece, where it's meant to sort of represent perfection and harmony in images like the Doryphorus. Here it sort of represents a kind of swagger, as we see this very sensualized Hermes stopping to take a rest. In his hand he probably would have had a bunch of grapes that he is about to feed to his little brother. Dionysus is the god of wine, so it's appropriate that he would have grapes. But also look at the connection between these two, the way they're touching each other. There is and when I say sensuality, I don't always just mean sexuality. Sensuality pertains to the senses, so touching, feeling, this sort of physical involvement, in this case a kind of a brotherly love, is being shown here, that in a way that we would not normally see a kind of display of emotion in classical Greek sculpture. So we have sensuality, we have emotion. These are all new. And why are they here? They're here because Greece has gone through changes. It's gone through devastating war. It's gone through being conquered. It's gone through being sort of the most powerful and respected culture in the area to one that has been devastated. And these kinds of huge historical changes bring changes on the psyche. And so we see sort of an abandonment of that perfection and that sort of almost, I won't say unemotional quality of the classical, but certainly a reserved, a restrained quality that is now gone. And we see a little more emotion. Speaking of emotion, this is a work by a guy named Scopas of Paros. And I apologize for putting Paros twice. I guess I really wanted you to know that. Scopas is known for his intense emotion. So where Praxiteles is our sensual guy, Scopas is our emotional guy. And you can see that here on the left in this image of this head of Heracles, but it's on the image on the right that I really want you to take a look. This is a grave stele, just like the one at Hegoso we saw, but this is slightly different. This is extremely emotional. It is extremely sad. This is a grave stele of a young hunter, a man who died in his prime, and we see him surrounded by his family, by a child who, I'm not sure whether this is his son or his little brother. We even see the dog mourning. We see his father, with old man, hand on his cane, with this look of just deep sorrow on his face as he stares at his son. His son with the body of this classical Greek nude, which we're used to seeing, this sort of perfect body, is removed though. He's surrounded by these figures, but he's not part of the scene. He looks out at us, not with the figures around him, because he is not there. He is dead. And so what we're seeing is a real sense of loss, a real sense of emotion, a sense of being sort of imperfection in a way, right? Where the classical Greeks were so obsessed with making sure that all the T's were crossed and all the I's were dotted and everything looked perfect. Here we have this sort of deep imperfections, feelings of doubt. Gone is this sort of feeling of confidence. And what we have a feeling of sadness and doubt and emotion. Even the dog feels it, right? So that's Scopas. Lysippos. Lysippos is sort of the Polykleitos of the late classical. He established a new canon, and his canon was based less in reality and more in sort of an ideal. It was based more in an ideal sort of beauty. And so we go from a tweaking of proportions. We go from, on the left, Polykleitos, which was the canon, the set of standards, the set of rules. That's what a canon is. A set of standards of the classical era, standing 7 heads tall. We have this figure standing 8 heads tall. His head is smaller, his body is longer and leaner, and more unrealistic. We have this idealized body. Once again, this would have been a bronze original. So the tree trunk here, as well as the one in our classical sculpture, would not have been there. Those are there to hold up the marble sculptures, which are more fragile. These are Roman copies. Once again, the Romans liked marble. They liked copying Greek sculptures, but they preferred marble over the Greek bronzes. Lysippos was so loved that even Alexander the Great asked him to create his portrait, because Alexander felt like only Lysippos could capture his passion and his emotion. So in this image called the Apoxiomenos, or the scraper, we see something very different than Polykleitos's Doryphorus. We see images of athletes, and in fact, the scraper he has just competed, and now he is scraping the oils and the dirt off of his body from the competition. He wouldn't have showered, but instead he would have had this little device called a strigil that he would have scraped everything off with. So once again, we have this contrapposto, but we have I like to call it a sassier contrapposto, a more sensual contrapposto, just like we saw in Praxiteles. We also have a more sort of innovative use of space. Notice how his fingers and his hands sort of thrust out at you. These late classical figures take up more space. They sort of insert themselves into their surroundings in a way that classical sculpture doesn't. Late classical is almost interactive in the way the sculpture sort of pushes forward. So it's longer and leaner. Proportions are thinner. It's more sensual. It's more sort of interactive and obtrusive in our space. But there's a liveliness to it that I think is missing from the classical. The classical is about perfection and harmony and all of those classical ideals. Late classical, a little looser. Here's another example. This is called the Weary Heracles. This was found in Rome. This was also based on a bronze original by Lysippos. This is found in the Baths of Caracalla. It was found by a family called the Farnese family, a very powerful family who lived during the Renaissance and after, who we will encounter. If you're taking the second half of this course, you will encounter this family, very influential family. But they were digging around in Roman ruins called the Baths of Caracalla, these large baths that contain steam rooms and baths and a gymnasium. The Romans had these public gyms and baths that were a big part of their social life. And this, imagine this would have been in this sort of grand entrance with all this beautiful tile and this, marvelous, massive sort of lobby area of the Baths of Caracalla. And this is a massive sculpture. This thing is, almost 10.5 feet tall. And it is not only massive in its size, but it's massive in the way it depicts Heracles, this great hero. And we're actually looking at the depiction of 2 of his labors. We've talked about the labors of Heracles earlier. And under his left arm, you can see the skin of the Nemean lion. This lion who had impenetrable skin, that he killed by taking one of its claws and killing the lion with its own claws, because otherwise you couldn't cut it with a normal knife or a sword. Behind him are the apples of the Hesperides, which we saw in the Atlas sculpture from the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. way, way, way back in the early classical. But here we see a very different Heracles. This is a weary Heracles. This is a Heracles who has competed and gone through these horrifically trying labors, and it has worn him out, both sort of mentally and physically. And this is also a man who has still, even though this is a quest for redemption, remember, he's here to redeem himself after the horrific slaughter of his wife and family caused by Hera, but still, so this is a man who has experienced sorrow and suffering in a way that most people haven't, or they're incapable of. And so I love what Lysippos has done. He's taken this massive body, and this is also new. This isn't sort of the perfect, lean, mean, fighting athlete of the classical period, but this is this sort of massive, hulking, almost bear-like sort of man. He's almost impossibly, heroically large. So once again, exaggeration, emotion. And he's not this proud, strong hero anymore, but he's a hero who's beaten down almost by his own. It's almost like his own. He's almost beaten down. So the late classical is a period of great change and transition. We see artists experimenting with sort of the rules of how sculpture is supposed to look. They're experimenting with the proportions, and they're experimenting with new and, I would say, deeper emotional kinds of storytelling. Finally, we have this image of Alexander the Great, this bust, which was not made by Lysippos, but instead would have been based heavily, though, on a work by Lysippos, or the kinds of sculptures of Alexander by Lysippos. And you can see that sort of emotion and drama in the face here. Late classical painting was also very innovative, what we have of it. This is not a painting, this is a mosaic. A mosaic is an image made by small little pieces of tile attached to a surface. This is called a pebble mosaic because these are small, basically clay pebbles of different colors that have been embedded into a surface. But here you can see the Greeks are starting to experiment with shading in their paintings to create a three-dimensional sort of appearance. We also see that influence of Polygnotos that we saw earlier in the classical period, with the removal of just one single ground line, and instead we have this complicated sort of arrangement of figures on different levels. But also notice the sort of drama of the moving of the bodies. Just like with the image of the scraper with his arm sort of sticking out into space, we have these figures who are much more complicated in the arrangement of their limbs compared to their body. So this is very much an innovation of the late classical, these more dramatic sorts of poses. We can see this in this very rare wall painting also of the god Hades abducting Persephone from a wall painting. We can see that those dramatic postures as Persephone reaches out from Hades' clutches. Her body forms this rather complex, the word is foreshortened. It's this concept where you have an object sort of coming at you from the picture plane. So we have this foreshortened Persephone. And then, of course, we have this very dramatic use of shading here to give the feeling of depth, and we can also especially see that in the garment, the cloth around the body of Persephone here. But without a doubt, the most dramatic painting, and once again, this is not a painting, but this is a copy, a mosaic copy of a Greek painting. This was found in the Roman city of Pompeii, so it was based on a Greek original, but this is a Roman copy. The Romans loved them some Greeks, so we got a lot of Greek stuff that survived through Roman copies. This is an image of the Battle of Issus. This is one of the definitive battles of Alexander's career. This is where he defeats the Persian army, and very famously later on will go and burn the city of Persepolis, which we studied early on this semester. But look at the chaos. That Greek classical, sort of high and early classical sense of order is completely gone. And we have this dramatic emotional overlapping of the figures. We have this foreshortened horse. You can see his rear end sort of thrusting right out at us. So that's a perfect example of foreshortening. It's a very difficult technique to accomplish. But just the drama that is created by this incredibly technically difficult painting. You have all of these different bodies sort of moving different ways on different angles, different planes. But it is in the faces where we can really see the difference. On the right, we have the face of the Persian enemy, Darius III. Shown here with a look of fear, with a look of almost horror on his face. And we know that historically he will flee the battle. This will not only help Alexander attain victory, but sort of historically it puts Alexander in kind of a position of moral authority, of a person who will not abandon his troops. But if you compare the way the two are portrayed, it's almost night and day. This look of fear, this sort of unorganized, we already talked about, appearance of the army of the Persians. But then we look over here on the left and we see this extreme focus, this look of sort of utmost control and power and a kind of almost a fierceness. So this is not the rational, classical Greek face that we're used to. This is not the Doryphorus or Critias boy or Riachi warrior. This is not a thinking man's, although, you know, Alexander was a brilliant tactician, but this is not about thought. This is about action, and this is about power. And when you look at this sort of in the grand scheme of things, I love the way these two characters are portrayed. They seem to sort of stand out and rise above the fray. And you can almost see Alexander like shooting lasers straight at Darius as they look at each other over the battlefield. And with Alexander, it's like a hunter going after his prey, and with Darius is, you know, like a deer in the headlights, and he's absolutely afraid. So we have this incredibly complex arrangement with foreshortened horses, with overlapping figures, with intense emotion, with chaos. So gone are the order, the rationality of the Greek classical and of the high and early classical, and what we're left with is this sort of late classical intensity. And in our next phase, we're only going to see that intensity increase. The last thing we're going to take a look at are a few little bits of late classical architecture. This is a Greek theater. Greek theater, many of you have probably had to read some Greek plays, tragedies, or comedies for class. Greek theaters weren't just for entertainment. In fact, they primarily served a religious function. These plays were put on by different sort of groups of people, the citizens themselves from various Greek towns, neighborhoods, sort of clans who would put on these plays as part of a sort of public ritual ceremony in honor of a god, in honor of the god Dionysus. These were meant to be instructional and moral. There's that word again, moral plays. These plays always ended in tragedy, and they introduced the concept of catharsis, this sort of feeling of sort of emotional The last thing we're going to look at are a few buildings from the late classical. This is a theater. Greek theaters are where plays were performed, but unlike today where people went to plays solely for entertainment, Greek theaters were performed only in certain Greek plays were only performed certain times of the year as part of religious festivals. These plays often had morals to them. They were designed to make the spectator feel sort of an emotional awakening, emotional resonance with the sort of moral story that was being told. These were put on as a part of a much larger festival. The Greek theaters were always built in the side of the mountain. There was one built next to the Parthenon as part of the sacred rituals and rites and holidays there. This comes from a place called Epidaurus, but it's the same sort of idea. In fact, this is the largest theater. It was something like 12,000 spectators. It had 55 rows. You can see the numbers, 387 feet in diameter. But these theaters were always built in the sides of mountains because the Greeks didn't have the technology to sustain sort of a large half-bowl shape like this without it collapsing. So the mountainside or a hillside were always carved away, and these were inserted in there. The basic parts of the theater are the orchestra, where the play itself would be performed, and then the cavea, where the half bowl shape we call it, and then these little individual wedges called cuneus or cunei for the plural, which literally means wedge. This word might seem familiar because it looks very similar to the Mesopotamian form of writing, the writing we saw in Sumer called cuneiform, which was given that name because it looks like little wedge shapes. So the Latin word for wedge is cunei. So these were sacred sites as well as much as they were places of entertainment. Speaking of sacred site, one last kind of architecture I want to look at, that we're not going to look at very deeply here, but I do want you to be aware of it. It's called a tholos. This is a different kind of tholos. Don't confuse this tholos with the Mycenaean tholos, the beehive tomb. This is not a tomb. This is another kind of tholos. This is the same word, different meaning. These are round temples. This comes from a place you're familiar with, Delphi. This is where we saw the Siphnian treasury earlier in the Archaic period. But these were small, used mostly for these temples, these tholoi is the plural, and consisted usually of a peripheral or a peripteral style colonnade around a central drum area in the center. I just wanted to bring that to your attention. And the last object from the classical we'll be looking at is a third and final style. We've already looked at two. We've already looked at the Doric, which was the simplest and most severe, and then we looked at the Ionic, which was more decorative with the curly volutes. And now this is the third and most elaborate, called the Corinthian. So you'll notice as Greek art and architecture, as we move through sort of the periods of Greek architecture, it becomes more elaborate and more stylized and more decorative. And we saw that with the figures becoming more emotional and more dynamic and more dramatic. And we see that even in the architectural elements. And so this final style is really quite something to see. Instead of the simple volutes of the Ionic, we see these complicated volutes. In fact, some people say that the Corinthian is not a separate style, but it's just a variation of the Ionic. But because in other ways, the temples look pretty much like Ionic temples, except for the capitals. But this comes from a story. A sculptor named Callimachus invented this style in the 4th century. The story is probably not true, or if it is true, it's been expanded on. But the story is that there is this beautiful, sweet maiden who dies, and her nurse collects these objects, these goblets that she loved, and puts them on her grave. She puts them in a basket, and they sit, this heavy basket loaded with these metal objects, on her grave. And there's an acanthus plant that is growing underneath. As it grows, it is crushed by the basket, and so the acanthus leaves grow outward from the basket. So that's the story behind it. It's a sort of sweet, beautiful story, like the memory of this maiden is preserved in these columns. It's probably not true. But nonetheless, that is the sort of origin story of this. But what's significant about this and all late classical art is the much more decorative and elaborate nature of the art compared to the more sort of stripped down and severe style of the earlier classical periods.